Ul'dah, the jewel of the desert, the sultanate city-state that claims the arid lands of Thanalan as their own. A city of contrasts, where the richest men and women of Eorzea have their every need catered to in the luxurious oasis gardens, while the poor and destitute suffer in the back alleys, fighting over any piece of shade to hide from the ruthless desert sun. A city where whatever you desire can be bought for a price, and where lives come cheap and plenty. I am Elja Jgnewesfv, and today I will be introducing you to the starting city of the gladiators, thaumaturgs, and pugilists. Here, people flock to the bazaars and hanging gardens of Ul'dah, hoping to strike a vein of purest gold in the hills of Thanalan under the banner of the Miners' Guild, or to be worshipped as the new champion of the Colosseum, sweating and bleeding their days away in the halls of the Gladiators' Guild. Ul'dah's patron deity is Nald Thal, or rather the twin deities of Nald and Thal together. Their symbol is the perfectly aligned scale, and they are the keeper of the living and the keeper of the dead. They are also the god of commerce and protector of merchants, an apt deity to worship in a city so obsessed with coin. Unlike the practical focus of Limsa Lominsa or Gridania's many guilds, the crafters of Ul'dah focus their efforts on finer things. Here one can purchase delicate fabrics and haute couture at the Sunsilk Tapestries, or beautifully crafted jewelry at Ishtaim's Aesthetics, backed by the Weavers and Goldsmiths Guild respectively. The Sapphire Avenue Exchange offers goods from near and far, and the bazaar never seems to close, patrons browsing the many inventories all around the clock. Ul'dah is formerly ruled by the members of the Ul dynasty, and their latest scion is Sultana Nanamo, the 17th in the line of Ul. But while she still remains beloved and respected by her people, the Sultana rarely has much say over the Syndicate, a council of Ul'dah's 6 most powerful merchant lords. These two factions are not always at odds, rather quite the opposite, but it remains a fact that Sultana Nanamo's authority stands on uncertain grounds. But it was not always so. At the dawn of the 6th Astral Era, over 1500 years before the plot of the game, the War of the Magi had caused untold destruction to the lands of Eorzea. Due to a massive conflict between the white mages and black mages, the calamity of water, a massive tidal wave that drowned the lands, swept away much of what had not yet been destroyed in the conflict, and the people scrambled to survive in its aftermath. And as things slowly returned to a modicum of normality, the common outcry was to ban the wielding of magic, as its use had caused the elemental imbalance that had brought about the calamity in the first place. Spellcasters of all sorts faced persecution, so they were forced to hide in the outskirts of civilization. Mahach, the powerful nation of black mages, had survived in some form through their descendants, and these Lalafelinaires traveled together to the harsh desert wilds of Thanalan to found a new nation. Using their magic to uncover underground springs of water, they settled down and established a nation of Belladia. Belladia was not free of strife, however, and only a mere 200 years after its founding, the two sons of the dying sultan, Sasagan and Sasawefu, led their nation to civil war, as they refused to admit the other as the heir of their dying father. Even as their father passed, a mere year after the beginning of the war, the sons continued their battles, eventually settling 2 new cities, Sasawefu creating Sildi and Sasagan Ul'dah. For centuries after, the two states would occasionally wage war upon one another, but when the king of Sildi, Lalawefu, seized control of the sparse water resources of Thanalan in 1159, the people of Ul'dah grew desperate as their meager supplies were nowhere close to slaking their thirsts. 18 years later, the king would fall sick and Ul'dah saw their chance. Sasagan ul-Sisigan, the third of his name and ruler of Ul'dah, sent his forces against Sildin and laid siege to the city. Yet their defenses proved impenetrable, and the battle became a bloody, drawn-out affair. It was then that Sasagan ordered his thaumaturgs to break the stalemate, resulting in the creation of a powder that turned their bodies of the fallen into undead walkers. This powder was launched over Sildine's walls in secret, and soon enough the zombies had broken down any resistance left in the city. Sasagan wove a tale of how the desperate people of Sildine had done this to themselves to win the war, and brought with him the immortal flames and the armies of Ul'dah to purge these walking dead. Yet Sasagan would come to pay for this heinous deed. 40 years after Ul'dah's victory, a Hewer by the name of Baldur Thorn learned of the dark deed and accused the Sultan of this crime. Sasagan violently denied it and demanded Baldur's head, yet not even his personal guard would raise their weapons against this nobleman who was known for his honor and righteousness. Instead, Sasagan was imprisoned in the Marasaja pit, the deepest catacombs of Thanalin. Thorn and his descendants would rule Ul'dah as stewards for the next 200 years, and it would become a time of prosperity and peace. The powder was hidden and never made public, but an order by the name of the Arbiters of Truth was founded, whose purpose was to keep this truth alive and to never let the dust fall into another's hands. In 1270, Ul'dah was moved to where Sildi had once stood, and as the undead rose from the city's sewers in 1353, the Amal'jaa, the reptilian tribe that worship Ifrit and who have been enemies of the heirs of Belladia for generations, aided the Sultanate in purging this impure threat against their homelands, something the city would soon conveniently forget. The Ul dynasty would eventually be granted rulership once more, as the Thorns stepped down from their position. At this time, Ul'dah was already a powerful mercantile force, much thanks to the wise stewardship of the Thorns, and the Ul dynasty maintained and improved upon these relations. Yet this was not entirely to their benefit, and as the merchants grew wealthier, so did their influence over the political sphere. Ultimately, the Ul had to establish the Syndicate, an advisory group of 6 merchants who would help guide the future of the Sultanate. Ostensibly, they have no formal power, but ever since its founding in 1401, the Syndicate have been the true rulers of Ul'dah. In 1557, the king of Alamigo, Theodric the King of Ruin, was brought low by the revolution of his oppressed people. Yet even as they stood triumphant, the peasants and soldiers alike found themselves assaulted by Garlean soldiers under the banner of the 14th Legion, led by the legatus Gaius van Balsar. Van Balsar swiftly took control of the lands as viceroy and brought Alamigo under imperial rule. Thousands upon thousands of desperate citizens fled its borders, a vast amount of them ending up in Thanalin as refugees. Now they find themselves exploited as cheap, easily replaced labor, and while some members of the Syndicate, Rabban al-Din being the foremost, work to provide reasonable conditions for his countrymen, many of those who oppose the idea find support in the natives of Ul'dah, who grow more and more wary of the tents propped up against the city's grand walls and the urchins begging for money. The Grand Company of Ul'dah, the Immortal Flames, was once disbanded by the Thorn dynasty, as, at the time, it had been little more than the Sultan's personal army, yet one that had earned heroic standings amongst the people of Ul'dah for their valiant crusade against the undead. Rabban al-Din, an Alamigan refugee and former gladiator, courted the Syndicate with the idea to revive it as an army of the city and to protect against the possibility of a Garlean invasion. Rabban, being a member of the Syndicate himself, managed to convince the other 5, and the Immortal Flames were formally reinstituted under the Sultana Nanamo. Rabban chose the name Immortal Flames specifically to rekindle that sense of patriotism that the name carried, although the few who knew more about the truth found the idea troubling. Unlike the Sultan's Sworn or the Brass Blades, who served the Sultana and the Syndicate respectively, the Immortal Flames served the citizens of Ul'dah. The Brass Blades, however, are composed mostly of sellswords and mercenaries, and corruption is rife among its ranks. Finally, the Sultan's Sworn have long suffered from poor financing and support from the Syndicate, and have thus shrunk in numbers, yet they remain staunch defenders of the Sultana nonetheless. Nanamo Ul'namo ascended to the throne of Ul'dah at the age of 5 when her father suddenly passed. Being too young to understand the intricacies of politics for such a large nation, she was often dismissed as a mere figurehead of the state. Yet, as she has grown older and more comfortable in her position, she has shown a sharp and subtle mind for the dangerous game she is part of. Nanamo pardoned the gladiator Raban when she was only 9, and as she did, he swore an undying oath to serve as her sword. Not long after, he purchased the Colosseum, and thus became one of the members of the Syndicate, and has since proven a capable and loyal servant to the Sultana. The monetarists, the reigning faction of the Syndicate, wished to abolish the Sultanate and make Ul'dah a self-governed body, something that Raban opposes fiercely. Yet with this attitude prevalent among the power brokers, Nanamo has little sway in the council of the Syndicate. The Syndicate itself is composed of Lolorito Nanarito, the chairman of the East Aldenerd Trading Company, Prince Telegigi Adeleji of the Mirage Trust, Chief Foreman Firgaze Lotkiblisson of the Amal'jaa and Sons Mineral Concern, Prioress Devlala Devla of the Milvaneth Aquarium, and President Godbert Manderville, the owner of the Golden Saucer and co-owner of the Manderville and Manderville, together with his wife, Lady Julian. While the political sphere of Ul'dah's rule is certainly interesting, and we may return to it at a later date, that is far from all one can find in this jewel of the desert. The aforementioned Golden Saucer deserves a video all of its own, as it is a place of marvelous attractions and rides, gambling, and enjoyment of all flavors and kinds. Indeed, many of the Alamigan refugees have found employment under the Mandervilles, who treat them with a fair but somewhat stern hand. The Hourglass is the most reputable inn of the merchant strip, and home to the Quicksand, a tavern infamous for its rowdy crowds of drunkards and fools, where, if the rumors are true, unspeakable deeds of lechery and debauchery are commonplace. The Arseneth Ossuary is a massive temple under the care of the Order of Nald-Thal, and is a place of burial for many of the wealthiest and most influential citizens of Ul'dah. Among the priests of the Order of Nald-Thal, many have learned to wield the forces of thaumaturgy. Their guild leader, or leaders rather, are 6 Lalafell siblings of Dunesfolk ancestry. And for their help in calming the people of Ul'dah during the calamity, the Sultana saw to it that they were chosen to replace the previous guildmaster Mumuepo, who was convicted of embezzlement. Parallel to the Sapphire Avenue Exchange, the city's famous bazaar, runs the Pearl Lane, and while a storage and office area for the merchants of the said bazaar, it is also the haunt of many of the laboring men and women of Alamigo who toil away to earn enough to feed themselves. The Pearl Lane has a reputation of being a dangerous place to find yourself in, yet that might also be due to the many nooks and crannies where careless enemies of the monetarists may find their ends. 2 guilds are tightly connected with Raban's Colosseum: the Gladiators Guild, run by Milla Swordsong, the daughter of the previous guildmaster, and the Pugilists Guild, whose master Hamon Holyfist is considered something of an embarrassment due to his old age and lustful ways. These 2 guilds were founded due to the long martial history of the city, and while the Colosseum was originally a place for prisoners and captured enemies to fight it out, over time the free citizens of Ul'dah would join as well, forming an organization based on mutual prosperity. Originally, those who wielded weapons and those who fought with their fists shared a guild, but as time went on, the two groups grew more distinct and split off into their separate organizations. Yet they often find opportunity to compete, and there is a friendly rivalry between the two. And despite being unarmed and unarmored, the members of the pugilist guilds often learn many techniques and skills to fight any manner of opponent. As I mentioned earlier, Thanalan is a land rich in minerals and metals, and so the goldsmiths and the miners both prosper in Ul'dah. And while many claim that goldsmithing is only for those vain and obsessed with wealth, it is a fact that properly applied gemstones and noble metals can have magical properties and enhance both physical and spiritual strengths, not to mention that many tools of both adventurers and craftsmen alike are constructed using the delicate toolset of the goldsmiths. Their guild is overseen by Serendipity, a young woman of 19, and the youngest guildmaster in Ul'dah history, and well earned, as she mastered the craft at an early age under the tutelage of legendary goldsmith Kolbernal, whom she forced to teach her. The miners, while certainly not as refined as the goldsmiths, have a high standing in Ul'dah due to the valuable material they fetch under the baking heat of the Thanalan sun. Yet it was not always so, as the majority of miners came to the city with nary a coin to their name, and were thus exploited by larger mining concerns who saw them as nothing more than cheap labor. Yet the miners banded together and founded their own guild, which allowed them significantly stronger bargaining power to improve the working conditions of their members. Their guild leader, Adalberta Stern, is of Alamigan origin and came to Ul'dah at the age of 8. Her father passed away in a cave-in while trying to support his family as a miner, and thus she fights hard to ensure that members of her guild are taught the ins and outs of the trade in order that they will never find themselves beholden to nor exploited by another. Yet all that glitters is not gold, and the Alchemists Guild know this more than anyone else. Their trade was once despised and spat upon by the common folk as crackpot quacks conducting dangerous, unethical experiments, but those times are long since gone. Few industries would function without the alchemists and their purified concoctions and powders, whether it is natron for flavor or growth formulas for delicate woodwork. This guild supplies more or less every other branch of crafters in one way or another. Its guildmaster, Severian Lictor, keeps mostly to himself, obsessing over his pursuits, much to the chagrin of his staff who have to pick up his slack. Yet his brilliance cannot be denied, and thus he is tolerated, especially since he is sometimes plucked from his obsessive research in order to quickly boil up a solution to a wealthy client's embarrassing problems. And finally, of course, the redolent Rose and his Weaver's Guild must not remain unmentioned. A hell-scarred Rogadin of not even 30 years, this brilliant mind is the genius behind the Sultana's wonderful pink ceremonial gown, and much more. The textile industry of Thanalan has always been prosperous, being a natural meeting point between East and West. Yet as cheap fabrics flooded the Ul'dah markets in 1190, the guild was founded to ensure the quality of wares kept to a certain standard, simultaneously ensuring that foreign interests did not earn too strong of a foothold in the city. Much, much more remains unspoken about this old and powerful city-state, and despite the harsh climate of its location, or perhaps because of it, the citizens of Ul'dah are strong, independent and skilled, and ambitious to a fault. While this may be cause for their success, it is also a source of misery and suffering, and thus the scales remain firmly balanced. For the people of Ul'dah know that nothing comes without a price, and that only the strongest can survive the desert sun. Thank you so much for watching, and a big thanks to all my patrons who helped me work on this content. Bambi Parsons, a leader with an unbreakable will, and the Methuselah, her satanic majesty Danny, whose presence chills the blood, and Socrates Johnson, a scholar and masterful craftsman of stories. We also want to thank the Primogen Council of Alexander Kishtaria, Lauren Eason, Nikolai Marius Vorculescu, Prozian, and the Only Body. And we raise our cups in toast to the Elder Tsundere Lobster for their support. And thank you for watching, Warrior of Light. May the light of Hydaelyn ever shine your way.